There's a moment when you realize that everything you've been taught about power is backwards. It happens in a split second, usually during a confrontation you thought would destroy you. Someone is screaming in your face, their voice cracking with rage, their finger jabbing the air between you. The room is silent except for their fury. Everyone is watching. This should be your destruction. Instead, you feel something else entirely. You feel elevated. Not because you enjoy their pain, but because you understand, suddenly and completely, that their emotional explosion has just handed you something infinitely more valuable than whatever they think they're fighting for. You've just been given proof of your own power. Most people seek power through accumulation. More money, more followers, more titles, more noise. They believe influence comes from addition, from becoming larger, more visible, more present in the world of others. This is the thinking of children playing with blocks, stacking them higher and higher until the inevitable collapse. True power operates on a completely different principle. True power subtracts itself from the equation while multiplying its influence. It becomes less visible while becoming more essential. It retreats into shadows that somehow cast themselves over everything in the light. The ancient strategists understood this paradox. Machiavelli wrote that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. But he was describing something far more sophisticated than simple deception. He was mapping the architecture of perception itself, the way human consciousness creates hierarchies of significance. When you make yourself partially invisible, you don't disappear. You become mythical. You transform from a person who can be analyzed and predicted into a force that can only be felt and feared. Watch this principle in action. Sarah walks into the conference room where her colleagues are discussing the failed marketing campaign. The room goes quiet, not because she's the loudest voice, but because she never speaks unless her words will land like surgical strikes. She doesn't sit at the head of the table. She chooses the chair that allows her to see everyone while remaining slightly outside the main circle. When Marcus begins his defensive speech about budget constraints, she doesn't interrupt. She doesn't even look at him. She examines her fingernails with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for rare manuscripts. The silence stretches. Marcus's voice grows louder, then uncertain. By the time she finally looks up, the entire room understands that his explanation has just been weighed and found wanting, though she hasn't said a single word. "The budget wasn't the variable," she says finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who has been thinking while others have been talking. "The variable was assuming our audience thinks like we do." She pauses, not for dramatic effect, but because precision requires time. "Which they don't." Another pause. "Which we should have known." The meeting ends with a complete restructuring of the campaign, initiated by people who believe they thought of the solutions themselves. This is not manipulation in the crude sense. This is something far more elegant, the creation of intellectual and emotional space that others rush to fill, unaware that the space itself is your design. You don't push people toward your conclusions. You arrange circumstances so that your conclusions become inevitable destinations for their own thinking. The digital age has created new landscapes for this ancient art. Consider the phenomenon of the viral call-out, that modern ritual where moral outrage becomes a performance of virtue. Yesterday, someone posted a screenshot of your 3-year-old tweet, taking it completely out of context, demanding you explain yourself to their 10,000 followers. The old response would be defensive: clarifications, justifications, apologies. The new response recognizes opportunity disguised as crisis. You don't respond immediately. Speed suggests desperation. You don't respond angrily. Anger suggests they've touched something real. You don't respond at all for exactly 47 hours. Long enough for their outrage to peak and begin its natural decline, short enough that your silence is noticed rather than interpreted as absence. When you finally respond, it's not to them. It's a new post, seemingly unrelated, about the fascinating psychology of projection in digital spaces. You don't mention them. You don't need to. Anyone who reads both posts understands immediately who inspired your sociological observation. But more importantly, you've transformed the narrative from person defending themselves to expert analyzing a phenomenon they've personally experienced. The original attacker is left in a peculiar position. They can escalate, which now looks like harassment of someone who has moved on to more interesting topics. They can defend themselves, which acknowledges that your post was indeed about them while making them appear reactive. Or they can ignore it, which allows your reframe to become the dominant interpretation of the entire interaction. You've turned their attack into evidence of your insight, their moral posturing into a case study you can examine with clinical detachment. This transformation of attack into elevation follows a deeper principle. Machiavelli observed that since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. But he wasn't advocating cruelty. He was describing the mathematics of human psychology. Love requires reciprocity, demands proximity, creates dependency. Fear requires only recognition of capacity. You don't need to harm anyone to make them aware that you could, that you understand exactly how to reach the soft places in their carefully constructed personas. The truly sophisticated practitioner never needs to exercise this capacity. Its mere existence, properly communicated through strategic absence rather than dramatic demonstration, creates what military theorists call deterrence through uncertainty. People don't know exactly what you're capable of, but they sense it's more than they're prepared to test. This uncertainty becomes a kind of gravitational field around your presence, subtly altering the behavior of everyone within its range. James discovered this accidentally during his first year at the law firm. He was the youngest associate, expected to be grateful and invisible. During the weekly partner meeting, senior partner Davidson made a comment about bringing in fresh blood that knows how to take direction without asking inconvenient questions. The other associates laughed nervously. James said nothing. He didn't even look up from his notes, but something in his stillness made the room aware that his silence was a choice rather than submission. Davidson repeated his joke, louder this time, fishing for a reaction. James continued writing, his pen moving with the same steady rhythm as before. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone except James, who seemed completely unaffected by the growing tension. "Something wrong with your hearing, Morrison?" Davidson asked finally. James looked up slowly, his expression curious rather than defensive. "I'm sorry, were you addressing me specifically? I thought you were talking about the recruitment strategy." His voice carried no challenge, no sarcasm, just genuine inquiry. "Because if you're asking for my input on how we might better integrate new associates, I have some thoughts on that." The brilliant thing about this response is that it created a fork in the conversation where every path led to James's elevation. If Davidson backed down, he was retreating from a challenge issued by the youngest person in the room. If he escalated, he was being drawn into a substantive discussion initiated by someone he'd just characterized as helpless. If he tried to clarify that he was joking, he was explaining his humor to someone who had calmly chosen not to understand it as such. Davidson chose escalation. "By all means, Morrison, share your thoughts on integration." James's response redefined the power dynamic in real time. He didn't defend himself against Davidson's characterization. He didn't acknowledge that any characterization had been made. Instead, he used Davidson's invitation to present a detailed analysis of associate retention rates, client satisfaction correlations with team diversity, and competitive advantages of firms that better utilize junior talent. He spoke for exactly 4 minutes, using data Davidson couldn't challenge and insights that made Davidson's joke appear not just mean-spirited, but strategically short-sighted. When he finished, the room sat in silence. James returned to his notes with the same calm attention as before. The meeting continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Davidson never targeted him again, not because James had threatened him, but because James had demonstrated that attacks would be transformed into opportunities for demonstration of competence. Within 6 months, James was being assigned to the firm's most complex cases. Within 2 years, he was being courted by competing firms. The associates who had laughed at Davidson's joke were still hoping for acknowledgement. This principle extends far beyond professional environments. In intimate relationships, the same dynamic operates with even greater subtlety. Consider the moment when your partner launches into the familiar attack about your emotional unavailability, your failure to communicate, your mysterious distance that keeps them feeling uncertain about where they stand. The conventional response is defensive explanation. I do communicate. Here are examples. Your perception is unfair. This response accepts the premise that your emotional patterns require justification, that your internal landscape should be accessible for inspection and modification. The advanced response recognizes that their complaint is actually evidence of your power. If your emotional distance wasn't affecting them, they wouldn't be mentioning it. If they were truly certain about where they stood, they wouldn't need reassurance. Their attack reveals their dependency on your approval, your attention, your emotional availability. This is not cruelty on your part. This is simply the natural result of being someone whose inner world seems worth accessing. When they say, "You never tell me what you're really thinking," you don't defend your communication style. You become curious about their statement. That's interesting. What makes you think I'm thinking something other than what I've shared? This response doesn't deny their perception, but it requires them to explain the basis for it. Usually, they can't, because their complaint isn't based on evidence, but on feeling. They feel like they don't have complete access to you, which is true, because complete access to any interesting person is impossible. I just feel like there's always something more going on with you, they might say. There probably is, you respond simply. There's always something more going on with everyone, isn't there? This acknowledgement is simultaneously validating and frustrating for them. You've confirmed their intuition while making it clear that this depth is a feature, not a bug. You've transformed their complaint about your mystery into a recognition of your complexity. Instead of defending your right to privacy, you've made them aware that privacy is what makes any person worth knowing. The conversation that follows this reframe is entirely different from the conversation that would have followed a defensive response. Instead of debating your communication patterns, you're discussing the philosophy of intimacy itself. Instead of justifying your behavior, you're exploring the dynamics that make relationships interesting. You've elevated the discussion from personal criticism to intellectual inquiry, and in doing so, you've reminded them why they were attracted to you in the first place. But here's where the strategy transcends individual interactions and becomes a way of being in the world. The person who masters strategic absence doesn't just use it in moments of conflict. They build entire personas around the principle that less presence creates more impact. They become the friend who doesn't text back immediately, not because they're playing games, but because their responses are thoughtful enough to require time. They become the colleague who speaks rarely in meetings, which makes their contributions feel more significant when they arrive. They become the partner who maintains independent interests and friendships, which keeps them interesting rather than predictable. This is not emotional withholding or manipulative distance. This is the recognition that scarcity creates value, that mystery maintains attraction, that people treasure what they cannot completely possess. You're not withholding yourself to create artificial scarcity. You're maintaining the aspects of yourself that existed before any particular relationship, which keeps you whole enough to be worth relating to. The truly dangerous moment comes when others begin to recognize your pattern and attempt to counter it. Someone might say, "You're always so controlled, so calculated. It's like you never let anyone see the real you." This accusation is designed to make you prove your authenticity through emotional demonstration, to break your composure in order to validate their perception of your humanity. The sophisticated response recognizes this as a test disguised as an attack. They're not really complaining about your self-control. They're trying to breach it. Your composure isn't evidence of calculation, it's evidence of genuine self-possession. The person who is truly comfortable with themselves doesn't need constant emotional validation or reassurance that they're being perceived correctly. "You might be right," you respond thoughtfully, "though I'm curious what makes you think there's a real me that's different from what you've experienced." This response neither confirms nor denies their perception. Instead, it questions the assumption behind it. What is authenticity exactly? Is the controlled version of you less real than the uncontrolled version? Are people more themselves when they're emotional than when they're thoughtful? These questions don't require answers. They simply introduce complexity into what your challenger hoped would be a simple accusation. They transform the conversation from "you should be different" to "what does it mean to be authentic?" Once again, you've elevated personal criticism into philosophical inquiry. The pattern becomes clear. Every attack contains within it the seeds of its own transformation into something that serves your interests. This isn't because you're manipulative, but because you understand that conflict, properly handled, is always an opportunity for clarification. When people challenge you, they're really asking you to define yourself more precisely. When you respond with precision rather than defensiveness, you end up more clearly articulated than before the challenge occurred. This principle operates on every level of human interaction. In social media arguments, instead of defending your position, you ask questions that reveal the assumptions underlying the attack. In professional conflicts, instead of justifying your methods, you invite examination of the standards being applied. In personal relationships, instead of defending your character, you explore the dynamics that created the misunderstanding. Each time, the result is the same. The focus shifts from your supposed inadequacies to larger questions about communication, values, and human nature itself. You transform from defendant to philosopher, from target to teacher, from victim to observer of fascinating social phenomena. The ultimate expression of this approach comes when you realize that you don't need to win these interactions in any conventional sense. Victory isn't convincing others that you're right. Victory is remaining yourself while others lose themselves in reaction to you. Victory is maintaining your center while others are pulled into orbit around your stability. Machiavelli wrote that the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. The implication is that different situations require different approaches, that adaptability is the highest form of intelligence, but there's a deeper reading. The most effective strategy combines the fox's clever evasion with the lion's confident presence. You don't need to be the strongest force in any given situation. You need to be the most coherent one. Coherence under pressure becomes a form of power that others find simultaneously attractive and unnerving. They want to be around you because your stability makes them feel more stable. But they're also unsettled because your stability makes their instability more apparent. This creates a complex dynamic where people are drawn to you precisely because of qualities that sometimes make them uncomfortable. The key to managing this dynamic is understanding that their discomfort isn't your responsibility to resolve. Your job isn't to make others comfortable with your self-possession. Your job is to remain possessed of yourself regardless of their comfort level. This doesn't mean being cold or unresponsive to others' needs. It means distinguishing between genuine needs and emotional demands, disguised as needs. When someone says they need you to be more emotionally available, are they expressing a legitimate need for connection? Or are they demanding that you manage their anxiety about your independence? When someone says they need you to be more communicative, are they asking for clearer information, or are they asking you to fill silence that makes them uncomfortable? When someone says they need you to be more predictable, are they asking for reliable behavior, or are they asking you to become less interesting so they can feel more secure? These distinctions matter because responding appropriately to legitimate needs builds relationships, while responding to disguised demands for emotional management destroys your effectiveness in those relationships. The person who manages others' anxiety becomes responsible for others' anxiety, which creates a dynamic where your power is constantly being donated to the maintenance of their emotional stability. The alternative is to become someone whose emotional stability is so genuine that it influences others towards stability rather than demanding that you destabilize yourself to match their fluctuations. This requires a fundamental shift in how you understand your role in relationships. Instead of being someone who adapts to emotional weather, you become someone who creates emotional climate. Creating emotional climate happens through consistency of response rather than consistency of mood. You don't need to be happy all the time. You need to be grounded all the time. You don't need to be agreeable all the time. You need to be reliable all the time. Reliability in this context doesn't mean predictability. It means that people can count on you to respond from your center rather than from reaction to their energy. This kind of reliability becomes magnetic because most people live their lives buffeted by emotional weather systems they don't understand and can't control. They experience their moods as forces that happen to them rather than states they participate in creating. When they encounter someone who seems to have a different relationship with emotional experience, someone who appears to choose their responses rather than be chosen by them, they recognize something they want to understand. But here's where the dynamic becomes complex. They want to understand your emotional self-possession, but they also want to test it. They want to see if your stability is real or performed, genuine or calculated. These tests come in many forms. Some people will try to provoke emotional reactions to see if your composure breaks. Others will create crises to see if you'll abandon your center to rescue them. Still others will withdraw their approval to see if you'll pursue it. Each test is an opportunity to demonstrate that your stability isn't dependent on their validation, their approval, or their emotional state. This demonstration doesn't require dramatic gestures. It simply requires consistency. When they try to provoke you, you remain curious about their need to provoke rather than reactive to the provocation itself. When they create crisis, you offer help without absorbing their anxiety. When they withdraw approval, you continue being yourself without pursuing their validation. Over time, these demonstrations accumulate into a reputation for reliability that becomes its own form of influence. People begin to seek your perspective not because you've convinced them you're right about everything, but because you've demonstrated that you're not thrown off course by the kinds of things that destabilize others. Your opinion becomes valuable because it emerges from stability rather than reactivity. This is where the strategy transforms from technique into identity. You're no longer someone who uses strategic distance occasionally when it serves your purposes. You become someone whose natural way of being in the world creates strategic advantages simply by being authentic to your own nature. The distance isn't calculated. It's the natural result of being centered in yourself rather than scattered across other people's emotional weather systems. The person who achieves this integration discovers something remarkable. They don't need to manage their influence because their influence manages itself. People are drawn to stability without needing to be convinced of its value. They seek out centered perspectives without needing to be sold on their importance. They want to be around someone who isn't constantly adjusting themselves to accommodate external pressures, because such a person makes them feel like adjustment might not be necessary. This natural influence operates according to principles that seem paradoxical but prove consistent in practice. The less you need others' approval, the more they want to give it. The less you need to be understood, the more they want to understand you. The less you need to be included, the more they want to include you. The less you need their validation, the more valuable your validation becomes to them. These paradoxes aren't contradictions. They're expressions of fundamental truths about human psychology. People value what is scarce, respect what doesn't need their respect, and trust what doesn't depend on their trust. When you become someone who doesn't need these things from others, you become someone who can offer them authentically rather than trading them for your own psychological needs. The final level of mastery comes when you realize that this approach isn't just a strategy for managing difficult people or situations. It's a way of being that attracts easier people and creates more manageable situations. When you stop participating in drama, less drama occurs around you. When you stop engaging with manipulation, fewer people attempt to manipulate you. When you stop being reactive, fewer people try to provoke reactions from you. This isn't because you've isolated yourself from challenging interactions. It's because you've changed the context in which interactions occur. People who are looking for emotional entertainment find you less interesting as a target because you don't provide the kind of responses they're seeking. People who are looking for stability and genuine connection find you more interesting because you offer something they actually want. The shift happens gradually, then suddenly. One day you realize that most of your relationships have become easier, not because you've learned to manage difficult people more effectively, but because difficult people have largely removed themselves from your orbit. They found more reactive targets, more dramatic scenarios, more emotionally volatile environments where their patterns can play out with greater satisfaction. What remains are relationships with people who appreciate stability, value depth, and respect boundaries. These relationships don't require the sophisticated defensive strategies you've developed because they don't involve the kinds of attacks and manipulations those strategies were designed to handle. Your influence in these relationships comes not from your ability to handle conflict, but from your ability to create the kinds of interactions where conflict becomes unnecessary. This is the true sophistication of power. Not the ability to win battles, but the ability to create conditions where battles don't occur. Not the skill to defend yourself from manipulation, but the presence that discourages manipulation attempts. Not the technique to manage difficult people, but the gravitational field that attracts easier ones. You discover that influence, properly understood, isn't something you exercise on others. It's something that emerges from who you are when you're being yourself without apology or adjustment for others' comfort. This kind of influence doesn't need to be maintained through effort because it's generated by authenticity rather than performance. It doesn't need to be defended because it's not dependent on others' recognition or approval. In the end, you realize that the most sophisticated power isn't power over others at all. It's power over yourself that happens to be so attractive to others that they naturally orient themselves toward it. They don't follow you because you've convinced them to. They follow you because following someone who knows where they're going feels better than wandering without direction. They don't submit to your authority because you've imposed it. They recognize it because authority based on genuine self-possession is unmistakable once encountered. This is what Machiavelli really understood when he wrote about the prince, who could be both feared and loved. He wasn't describing someone who manipulated emotions to control others. He was describing someone whose genuine authority was so apparent that others wanted to be in relationship with it rather than opposition to it. Fear and love, in this context, aren't opposite reactions to the same person. They're complementary recognitions of someone who has achieved something rare, complete ownership of their own experience. The shadow you cast isn't darkness imposed on others. It's the natural consequence of standing firmly in your own light. And those who choose to stand within that shadow discover that it's not cold or threatening. It's the kind of protection that allows them to find their own light without having to compete with yours for space to shine. You influence from the shadows, not because you hide from the light, but because you've become the source of illumination that makes the shadows possible. This is power that serves itself by serving others, authority that strengthens itself by strengthening those who recognize it, influence that grows not by taking, but by creating more space for everyone within its range to become who they actually are.